Every century has a few events so destructive that they leave people standing directly in the path of whatever the earth or sea delivers. Some made it out. Many didn't. From cyclones to floods and earthquakes, these were moments when nature didn't just test people, it completely overwhelmed and annihilated them. I'm Mike with List 25, and these are the 25 deadliest natural disasters in history, ranked by death toll. 25. The 1912 China Typhoon. When the 1912 China Typhoon made landfall, it brought a level of destruction that only a few coastal regions were prepared to handle. The storm gathered power for days, reaching wind speeds of around 115 miles an hour before pushing into Zhejiang. Once it arrived, it delivered 24 hours of heavy rain and a surge that overwhelmed rivers from the mountains to the sea. Villages in Qingtian and nearby towns were destroyed as water rushed through the streets faster than people could get away. Some reports actually say entire communities disappeared within minutes. Any attempt to count the dead was nearly impossible, because entire districts were wiped out, but even the most cautious estimates still reached tens of thousands. 24. St. Felix's Flood. Zeeland, a coastal region in what is now the southwestern Netherlands, has always lived in a delicate balance with the sea. In 1530, that balance collapsed when a storm surge pushed across the North Sea and overwhelmed the dikes protecting South Beveland, North Beveland, and East Watering. Water spread across the island so quickly that 18 villages were lost before any of the inhabitants could escape. Reimersval, one of the most important cities in Zeeland at the time, was nearly erased, and the land itself changed so dramatically that Zuid-Beveland became known as the Drowned Land. More than 100,000 people died as homes, farms, and communities vanished into the surge. The disaster became one of the events that pushed the Netherlands toward the advanced flood control engineering it's famous for today. 23. The Hanoi and Red River Delta Flood. North Vietnam's Red River Delta used to be one of the most crowded agricultural regions in Southeast Asia, and by 1971, its dikes were carrying the weight of a growing population, years of war damage, and limited repairs. When the monsoon rains began that August, the river rose faster than the system could handle. Water spilled over the embankments, broke through weakened sections, and spread across hundreds of thousands of acres. Some areas saw the river climb about 33 feet above the surrounding fields. Roughly 100,000 people died, and millions were pushed from their homes as crops, roads, and entire villages were lost under the flooding. 22. The Ashgabat Earthquake. The 1948 Ashgabat earthquake struck at night, hitting the capital of what is now Turkmenistan with a magnitude of 7.3 and an intensity strong enough to level entire districts. Homes built of raw brick collapsed almost instantly, and reinforced concrete buildings suffered major structural failures. Ground fissures opened up across the city, some stretching for hundreds of yards, and water pipes split as the soil shifted beneath them. Villages around Ashgabat were hit just as hard. Places like Kanto, Anao, and Kuru Gaudan saw nearly every structure fall, and reports from the time described new springs bursting from the ground, wells rising by about 6.5 feet, and pipelines ripped apart as the earth compressed and heaved. Entire communities were buried in rubble, and thousands more were injured, making it one of the deadliest earthquakes of the 20th century. 21. The Messina Earthquake. In the early hours of December 28, 1908, the Strait of Messina was hit by a magnitude 7.5 earthquake with no warning, and the force of the shaking tore through both of the surrounding coastlines. Most of Messina's houses were destroyed within seconds because they were held together with a type of mortar that was too weak to handle lateral movement. The tsunami that came afterwards also flooded the port districts, overturned rail cars, and pushed ships and steamers around as if they were small boats. The landscape was left unrecognizable once the water retreated. An estimated 120,000 people died, many of them caught inside buildings that collapsed all at once. 20. Cyclone Nargis. Cyclone Nargis was one of the deadliest tropical cyclones ever recorded. It struck the Irrawaddy Delta in May 2008, sending a surge over 10 feet high across thousands of square miles of farmland. Many villages along the delta were destroyed, leaving hundreds of thousands without food, shelter, or clean water. At first, relief efforts were delayed because the government was slow to let outside agencies enter the country. Ships with supplies waited offshore while talks continued. So during those first few days, people in the delta were completely left to their own devices. But international teams were eventually allowed in and reached much of the region. Since then, Myanmar has improved radar coverage, built more shelters, and started new training programs to be better prepared for future storms. 19. The 1991 Bangladesh Cyclone. The southeastern coast of Bangladesh lies on a river delta, where the land opens into farms, fishing villages, and long stretches of shoreline. People live there for the rich soil and steady work from the sea, but the area offers little protection when a big cyclone arrives. In April 1991, Cyclone 2B was tracked for days as it moved across the Bay of Bengal. It strengthened over the warm water before hitting the Chittagong region with winds near 150 miles an hour. There were shelters, most built after the devastating 1970 storm, but many families decided to stay in their own huts. When the water surged nearly 20 feet high, entire islands were flooded and thousands of people were swept into the open water. The storm lasted for hours. By the time relief teams reached the delta, more than 130,000 people had died, and millions were left without shelter or food. 18. The Great Kanto Earthquake. Japan sits on a jumble of tectonic plates, and the Kanto region happens to sit right where the Philippine Sea Plate keeps pushing underneath Honshu. All that pressure built up along the Sagami Trough until it finally snapped on September 1st, 1923. The ensuing magnitude 7.9 earthquake struck a densely populated Tokyo-Yokohama metropolitan area just before midday. At Yokohama's port, steel cranes collapsed. In Tokyo, major roads broke apart, forcing people to climb over broken pavement as aftershocks continued. Storage tanks near the docks leaked fuel, starting fires along the waterfront, and ships trying to help survivors had to move through floating debris. Rural towns also suffered, with ruined wells and farmland damaged by landslides. Both cities were reduced to almost nothing. 17. The 1935 Yangtze flood. Central China had faced years of damaged waterways before the 1935 monsoon season began. Heavy rain fell, and all the rivers in the Yangtze basin were already higher than unusual even before summer started. By July, the dikes were full, and the ground couldn't take another drop of water. So, farmland in provinces like Hubei, Hunan, and Jiangsu flooded. People in farming towns tried to escape on foot or by boat, but a lot of them had no way to outrun the rising water. Drowning claimed thousands right away, but the aftermath was just as terrible. The flood destroyed the year's harvest, and clean water was scarce. Thousands of people became sick with typhoid and dysentery, pushing the death toll even higher while the people waited for relief. The 2004 Indian Ocean Tsunami. If you were around in 2004, you probably remember exactly where you were when you first heard about the Boxing Day tsunami. The disaster began with a massive undersea earthquake near northern Sumatra. It released more energy than thousands of atomic bombs. The 9.1 magnitude quake ripped through the ocean floor, pushed water upward, and sent waves speeding across the Indian Ocean that traveled almost as fast as a jet. Banda Aceh was the closest big city to the earthquake, and the first waves hit it within minutes. Some were over 100 feet high, sweeping away whole neighborhoods before anyone knew what was happening. The waves then moved on and struck Sri Lanka, India, Thailand, and Myanmar with no warning. When the water finally stopped, about 230,000 people were gone, and entire coastlines looked as if they had disappeared. 15. The Aleppo earthquake of 1138. Aleppo's disaster struck at a time when there was no steel, no warning systems, and no organized rescue teams. The city lies where the Arabian and African plates meet, and that fault line has been moving for centuries. In October 1138, it finally gave way. Some families felt the first tremor hours before the disaster struck and got out of the city, but most stayed. The estimated 7.1 magnitude earthquake struck the next day, and the city walls were the first to fall. Stones crashed into the narrow streets, the citadel collapsed, and neighborhoods got buried underneath the rubble before people could escape. Small towns near Aleppo suffered just as much. The Crusader citadel at Haiyuan was destroyed. The fort at Al-Atarib fell, and some villages never recovered. Reports said the shaking could be felt as far away as Damascus, and the final death toll settled around 230,000 people. 14. The Ganja earthquake. Ganja was a busy medieval city tucked between mountains and trade routes, and nobody living there expected the ground to come apart the way it did. The region sits on a clash point between two major tectonic plates, and when that pressure finally gave way in late September 1139, the city didn't stand a chance. Survivors described a single violent shake followed by rolling movement that made it impossible to stay upright. The estimated 7.3 magnitude earthquake leveled everything from homes to towers almost all at the same time. But the biggest death toll came from around the city. Villages in the hills were wiped out by landslides as entire slopes gave way and buried everything in their path. Writers back then described the damage to forts and valleys, but almost nothing was left from the people who actually lived through it. 13. The Banqiao Dam failure. China built the Banqiao Dam in the early 50s to control flooding along the Huai River and store water for new farmland and growing towns in Henan. Back then, it stood for progress. Engineers reinforced it again in 1956, and officials were so confident of its strength that they called it the Iron Dam. People living downstream trusted it completely. That trust ended in August 1975 when Typhoon Nina stopped over the area and dropped huge amounts of rain into the reservoir. The water level rose so quickly that crews couldn't release it safely. And just after midnight, the dam broke and sent a wall of water across the Zumadian plain. Whole villages disappeared in seconds. Soon after, smaller dams downstream also broke, causing a chain reaction of flooding. Survivors faced disease, dirty water, and days without contact with the outside world. 12. The Antioch earthquake of 526. In late May 526, a huge earthquake struck Antioch and much of northern Syria, which were then part of the Byzantine Empire. Reports from the time say the city was destroyed in moments, with about 250,000 people killed. The quake was so powerful that the nearby port of Seleucia Pieria rose by almost 3 feet, which changed the way sediment settled and eventually choked off the harbor. Most modern estimates put the earthquake well above magnitude 7, which is strong enough to reach about 8 on the Mercalli intensity scale. The tragedy didn't end with the shaking. Fires broke out immediately afterward and burned through what little was left standing. Homes that survived the initial shock didn't survive the flames, and people trapped in the ruins had almost no chance of escape. 11. The 1920 Haiyuan earthquake. On December 16, 1920, a powerful earthquake struck northwest China. Modern seismologists estimate its magnitude at about 8.5. Haiyuan County was almost directly above the epicenter, and more than half its people died as homes, temples, and entire streets collapsed at once. The earthquake's shaking, in fact, triggered landslides across an area of nearly 7,700 square miles. Initial death toll estimates stood at 230,000. However, as researchers reviewed additional counties and old records, that number was later raised to about 273,000. At the time, travel and communication were so limited that it took until the next year for anyone to understand the full extent of the disaster, but it became part of the country's collective memory and is still talked about today. 10. The Coringa cyclone. Coringa was a major port on the Bay of Bengal when a massive cyclone tore into it on November 25, 1839. Nobody had instruments to measure the wind, but the surge alone was about 40 feet high. It pushed straight into the harbor, smashing ships, homes, warehouses, and anything tied to the shoreline into pieces. Thousands of ships were destroyed in one single night, and roughly 300,000 people died as the city was wiped off the map. The port never recovered and is now little more than a fishing village. 9. The 1737 Ganges Delta cyclone. In October 1737, a powerful storm rolled into the Ganges Delta and slammed into the young settlement out Calcutta. At the time, the city was small. Maybe only about 20,000 people lived there. But the storm surge and gale force winds flooded streets and homes, and company records from the British East India Company mention several thousand deaths in Calcutta alone. Over the years, the story and scale of the destruction grew in the telling, and those numbers turned into 300,000 deaths. Some later newspapers also claim that an earthquake hit at the exact same time, but historians now think some of the reports were only rumors and misinterpretations. Be that as it may, what we do know is that the cyclone tore through villages in the delta, sank boats on the Hooghly River, and left people convinced that storms from the Bay of Bengal could cause terrible destruction. 8. The Haiphong Typhoon. For days after the 1881 typhoon, Haiphong port looked nothing like a city. Boats lay scattered inland, homes were flattened, and the dead numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Haiphong sat in a vulnerable spot along a branch of the Red River. Most of its neighborhoods were built right at water level. When the surge arrived, it rushed through the inlet like water through a funnel and hit the port with almost no warning, forcing the water higher as it reached the river delta. Haiphong was an important trading hub at the time, and it was crowded with workers and merchants who lived close by the shoreline, which is why the loss of life was so devastating. 7. The 2010 Haiti earthquake. The 2010 Haiti earthquake struck along the Annihilated Plantain Garden Fault, a major fault running through the country's southern peninsula. The 7.1 magnitude quake only lasted a few seconds, but it hit near Port-au-Prince and was made worse by the valley's soft soil. Homes fell right away, schools were crushed, and thousands of people died or disappeared. Haiti did not have a working seismic network, up-to-date hazard maps, or a modern building code that was enforced, so the country simply had no way to prepare. Even the strongest organizations were overwhelmed. Government offices collapsed. The UN peacekeeping mission lost many staff members, and health clinics across the capital were destroyed. With more than 1 million people displaced and almost no authority to manage the crisis, the recovery turned into one of the most difficult relief efforts in recent history. 6. The Bhola Cyclone. The Bhola cyclone left a massive death toll in its wake, but the long-term fallout was just as devastating. Children born during those years in the worst-hit coastal areas ended up growing into adults with noticeable disadvantages. A lot of them had poorer health, less education, and lower incomes than children born in other parts of Bangladesh at the same time. The cyclone not only killed hundreds of thousands of people, but also wiped out crops, food supplies, fishing boats, and family savings. So parents had to focus on survival. They cut back on meals, sold what they owned, and often couldn't afford to send their children to school. So the bigger fallout influenced the next generation in so many ways that the government just couldn't foresee. 5. The Tangshan earthquake. When Tangshan was destroyed by a 7.6 magnitude quake in 1976, the effects reached far beyond the Hebei Plains. The disaster killed hundreds of thousands of people and destroyed one of China's main coal and steel centers overnight, but it also changed the country's political situation. Emergency teams struggled because entire neighborhoods had disappeared, communication was lost, and sadly, the Communist Party leaders were not united. Maoist officials refused international help and decided to handle the crisis themselves. Meanwhile, some of the younger leaders like Hua Guofeng and Deng Xiaoping were trying to gain more influence. By the time Tangshan was rebuilt 10 years later, China had changed too. Deng's modernization had started, and the new Tangshan, rebuilt in a safer place and made to handle future earthquakes, showed that China was leaving its revolutionary past behind. 4. The Shaanxi earthquake. Almost 1 million people dead sounds impossible until you look at the setting. In 1556, this region of China was densely populated and built on loose soil, a fine powdery sediment that breaks apart easily. A lot of people lived in homes that were literally dug into the hills. So when the estimated 8.3 magnitude quake hit in the middle of the night, the hills collapsed like sand. Whole villages were buried as the cliffs gave way. The cities weren't spared either. Huaxian, Weinan, and Huayin lost most of their buildings in the first shock, and aftershocks continued the damage into the next morning. Some reports mention crevices 60 feet deep and landslides that covered farmland with new hills of debris. Even if you trim the historical estimates, this disaster was deadlier than any other earthquake on record. 3. The Yellow River flood. The 1938 Yellow River flood is unique because it was created on purpose, by the government no less. And yes, it wasn't a natural disaster in the purest sense, but it does deserve a spot on today's list. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China after the Marco Polo Bridge incident, and the fighting spiraled into the Second Sino-Japanese War. Over the next year, Japan seized major northern and coastal cities, including Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing. By 1938, their armies were pushing inland toward central China, threatening Guangzhou, the rail network, and the nationalist government's ability to hold the country together. That's when the government made a drastic choice: breach the dikes at Banqiao and turn the Yellow River into a barrier. Once the banks gave way, the water tore south through Henan, Anhui, and Jiangsu, wiping out villages faster than warnings could reach them. By the end, as many as 900,000 lives were lost, and several million people were forced from their homes. 2. The 1887 Yellow River Flood. Still on China's Yellow River, there's actually a Guinness World Record for the world's deadliest flood, and it belongs to the 1887 Yellow River disaster. Farmers along the river built dikes here for several generations, raising them year after year as silt lifted the riverbed higher and higher. By the late Qing dynasty, the river flowed high above the surrounding land, and after several days of heavy rain, the dikes finally broke. When the break opened, the river didn't flood in the usual sense. It dropped onto the plain like a giant spill, racing across Henan and into neighboring provinces. Somewhere between 900,000 and 2 million people died from drowning, hunger, and disease, and about 2 million survivors were left homeless. Its impact carried forward for generations, and it, in all likelihood, played a role in the decision to weaponize the river in 1938. 1. The 1931 China floods. Most floods involve one river losing control. The 1931 disaster came from 3. After a brutal winter and a summer of record-breaking storms that refused to let up for months, the Yangtze, Yellow, and Huai rivers all overflowed together. Villages disappeared overnight. Boats drifted through what used to be neighborhoods, and Wuhan was turned into a lake so wide that ships sailed over the old streets for a whole season. Relief teams couldn't keep up with the disaster. Many people died from drowning, hunger, or diseases like cholera and dysentery, and millions didn't survive the year. Some reports estimated that up to 70 million people were affected in some way, from losing their homes to losing their entire harvests. By the time the rivers finally dropped, an estimated 3.7 million people had lost their lives. It remains the deadliest natural disaster ever documented, not because the water came all at once, but because it refused to go away. And that's a wrap. Now, we don't do a lot of historic ranked lists like these, but I think we can all agree that they definitely have a place in this world. If this list delivered and you're not subscribed yet, well, hit that like and subscribe button and the notification bell, because we're not always this morose. And if you like to keep going, our related video, 25 Worst Natural Disasters Ever Recorded, will give you your fix. The earthquakes, typhoons, and tsunamis on that list are all horrific in their own right. That video should be popping up right about here. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you again next time. Also, if I slurred my speech, I bit my cheek earlier today, so awesome. See you later.